dipped his hand into some icy cold water and took a nice, cool drink. It was 15 months and a long, hard journey that had brought him to this place. And Lewis is Meriwether Lewis, of the famous duo Lewis and Clark. He carried the weight of a nervous nights in strange lands, lots of mosquitoes, dark winter nights, grizzly bears, a brutal portage around a huge waterfall, and the loss of a close companion. Now Lewis and a small scouting party had joined and pushed ahead of the Corps of Discovery and joined with their Native American guides down a thin trail and up a creek into a small little spring, a little trickle of a spring. But this was the source of the mighty Missouri River, water that would run from there all the way down to the Gulf. And in that moment, he probably felt like the hard part of his journey was done. But the mission he had was very, very clear. It was from the president himself, Thomas Jefferson. He was commissioned on this expedition with one driving goal, and that was to find the Northwest Passage, the water route. He said, find the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent. See, the dream was bigger than the expedition itself. Whoever controlled that route would, of course, control power and commerce and everything that went with it across the entire continent. It was kind of like owning the internet today. So when Lewis drank from that spring, he tasted more than a refreshing, cool water. He tasted a centuries-old ambition coming true. Now he stood there and imagined the next scene that would unfold in front of him, cresting the next ridge, spotting that western river that would shoulder the canoes for just a short bit, and then float down toward the Pacific Ocean. And after months and months of rowing upstream, they finally pictured the current working with them on those days. So Lewis and the crew, they climbed up that next ridge, and he reached the top of that dividing ridge, and he looked out, and what he saw stopped him in his tracks. It was the majestic Rocky Mountains. Range after range after range, and peak after peak after peak. A landscape that was so overwhelming, it rewrote every single thing that they thought they knew. And that is the moment the expedition had to go off the map. See, canoes are brilliant tools when you have a river. And river spills get you far until that terrain changes. And in front of Lewis was a truth that you couldn't paddle up, you couldn't paddle around, and you couldn't paddle through, because you cannot canoe over a mountain. And that single realization is why this story matters for us today. Because that moment is bigger than history, it's true adaptive leadership. It's that moment when the mission stays steady, but the method to get there has to change. It's the moment when you realize that you're still called to move forward, but the path requires new skills, asking for some new guides, trying new things, learning new things, and traveling differently. See, in every field, leaders across the board are waking up to this. A futurist named Bob Johansen from the Institute for the Future describes our world as volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The ground has shifted, and it shifts fast. The work that was doing 5 years ago is now outdated. And the right next step requires two things from us. First, it's humility, and the second is learning. And maybe this is nowhere more obvious than in the church today, because the world in front of us is nothing like the world behind us. See, we love the river. We know our river. And many of us spent years learning how to paddle faithfully in our favorite canoes. But some of the canoeing but some of the canoeing that worked when the river was wide and the current was steady doesn't work the same when you're facing a mountain and shallow water. See, we can paddle harder, but we still end up going nowhere. We can perfect our old rhythm and still find ourselves staring at an unfathomable range of mountains in front of us. And this moment is asking for more than just give it another try or try a little harder. It's asking for adaptation. It's asking for new learning, and yes, it's asking for a different kind of tool for a different kind of terrain we're facing. So we're looking at a mission field in front of us where more and more of our neighbors are unchurched or dechurched. Trust has to be earned, and welcome invitation must be intentional with radical hospitality, and to make people feel like they are at home here. See, guests need clarity the minute that they walk in. Families need support that feel real and doable, and the path into church is not near as well trodden as it used to be. And we live in a post-Christian world where transformation for mission has to be central of who we are. And the urgency is real, because the world has changed around us, and that energy for transformation can only come from one place, and that is our drive as followers of Jesus. So we're not adapting to just merely survive. We want to adapt to thrive. We're adapting to reach that ever-changing world that's out there around us, participating in Jesus' mission, and being shaped more and more into the likeness of Jesus. And that's why the church exists, to reveal God's love as we join on that work out in this ever-changing world. So how do we remove obstacles and make room intentionally for people to meet Jesus? And how do we meet people right where they are today? In a moment like this, leadership is less about perfect plans and more about becoming a culture of learning. See, we're stepping into a season where we go forward together, where we will try and listen and improve, because new behaviors are what carry a church forward in a world that is constantly changing around us. So what do we do when we find ourselves carrying canoes and staring up at mountains? See, that's the framework for this whole series. And it starts right here at the ridge line. The same mission with a new map. See, we're not called to paddle harder and harder up a mountain. We're called to adapt with courage, stay anchored to our mission, and trust that God is making a way ahead of us. So over the next 3 weeks, we'll be digging into how we'll adapt and reach this ever-changing world around us. And we are not the first people of God to face a moment like this. The prophet Isaiah is speaking to people who felt disoriented and uncertain about what came next in their lives. So before we talk about methods and next steps, we're going to do what we do each and every week, and we're going to listen for God's voice. Because God does not leave his people without a way forward. So the prophet Isaiah is speaking to God's people in a very brutal season that they're going through. Jerusalem has fallen. People have been carried off into exile into Babylon. Everything familiar to them has been shaken. Their home, their worship methods, their security, and down to the identity of who they are. And they're living with grief and disorientation, and they're wondering if God even sees what's going on, or if God is even moving and God cares, or if their future has already just been decided. And it's into that mess, into a people who feel stuck and small and don't know a way forward, that God speaks a word of hope that is also a bit of a jolt for them. So God speaks to his people whose whole identity has been shaped through story, and very powerful stories that we read in the Old Testament, especially the Exodus story, whose recent trauma has trained them to be on alert being in captivity and also to be in survival mode. So when you get to Isaiah 43, it's actually a whole list. It starts off with God, what he's going to do, and how he cares for them, and how he loves his people. And I encourage you to go back and read it sometime this week. This is a beautiful, beautiful chapter. But in this chapter, he says, don't remember the prior things. Don't ponder the ancient things. See, this would be the opposite of what it seemed that they were always taught to do. Go back and remember how God was in these stories and in our past. But this wasn't something to say, hey, I'm going to erase your history. But it's God breaking the spell of a certain kind of remembering. Right. The kind where past becomes the only lens that we interpret our present and into the future. Because the former things can trap us in two different ways. Sometimes it's the pain that we've experienced. The failure, the loss, the shame, the disaster, the regret, the need for a do-over. And you keep replaying that over and over into your mind until yesterday is ending up with the final word. The other way that the past can trap us is about the glory days, the greatest hits, the stories of when God did this and he'll come and do it again. Now, the Exodus had become their main framework of how God works and how God saves. And they knew that seed story inside and out. They knew the pattern of God defeating the enemy, opens water, leads his people out, they're set into freedom. Now, in exile, that memory could start functioning like a template that they put in place. They could end up scanning the horizon for the same exact kind of rescue, shaped in the same way, and instead of missing a fresh path, God was already opening in this new landscape. Deliverance that would come through wilderness roads and life-giving water in barren places, and a return that didn't exactly mirror the Exodus. So this is the first move of faithful adaptation. To release what you're gripping so tightly that you can't move forward. And that's the ridgeline moment. River skills are great skills, and canoes are faithful tools. But when the terrain changes, the same tools that carried you so far can start to weigh you down. So this is God's mercy to a people at that ridgeline. And God is saying, I'm set down the old map that controls the lens that you look through and receive a new way forward. See, release creates room for a new perception. And perception is what gives people courage and possibility. So for the exiles, God doesn't start by describing a distant someday off in the future, but God starts speaking into their present, the today and the now. He says, I'm about to do a new thing. Now it's springing up. See, the rescue had already begun to break through the surface. So that's why the next thing he says to them is a question. Do you recognize it? See, the issue for Israel in exile is not whether God is active or God is going to come and save. The issue is whether they can perceive God's activity while they're still under the assumptions about old ways that God may work. See, then God paints the picture in the language the exiles would feel down to their bones. I'm making a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. That's definitely Exodus language, but it's a different kind of Exodus. In the first story, God made a way through water, and here God provides water within a dry land. So the terrain has changed, so the form of salvation changes. And God is saying, I will fit my rescue to the landscape that you're actually in. So the new thing is both practical and it ends up being breathtaking. It's a road where there wasn't one. It's provision where life shouldn't have been possible. It's God reshaping a hostile environment to give them a safe way home. It's God pointing at a different landscape and saying, this is not a river season. This is a wilderness terrain season. And the way forward is going to look different. And I'm already making a way. The new thing is God fitting the salvation to the terrain in front of them. A way that where there wasn't one, a provision where there shouldn't be any, a path that wouldn't match the old map. And the question don't you realize it? Is God pushing their eyes from the old map in their hands to the new terrain that is in front of them? Because new perception of where you are is what made people ready to move. So after God commands release in verse 18 and calls for perception in verse 19, God lands the point in verse 21. These people I formed for myself will declare my praise. See, for exiles, that statement is both identity and purpose, all wrapped into one. They're not an accident of history. They are a formed people. God shaped them, God held them, God carried them, He cared for them and kept them. So their life together would say something true about God in the world. See, in exile, it would have been easy for Israel to shrink back into survival mode. It would have been easy for them to just stay silent. It would have been easy for them, the only goal they had was to stay there and endure. But God speaks and lifts their heads. The new thing God is doing is aimed at restoring their voice. God is rebuilding a people who cannot just speak praise again, but shout it. Praise is more than singing. Praise is what becomes witness, a public life that points to God's presence and character out in the world. And the point of finding a way through the wilderness is never that wilderness itself. The point is the purpose on the other side. God is making a way so people can move again as God's people, formed and sent and visible. So the destination is a community that declares God's praise with everything in their being. So once they release the past as that controlling lens, once they lift their eyes and recognize the new thing that God is already doing, and once they remember their purpose to be a people formed to praise God, the only faithful move that is left is participation. This is where praise moves into motion. This is where a community steps into a new path God is making and starts walking it together. So the question is simple, but it's also direct. What is the next faithful step that matches our purpose and joins what God is already on the move doing? So here's what that looks like when a church is standing at the ridgeline with a canoe on their shoulder and a mountain in front of them. What we will stop doing. We'll release the assumptions that faithfulness means more than doing the same thing and doing it harder. See, Lewis and Clark were looking for a waterway to the Pacific, and they ran out of water. So how do you canoe over mountains? You don't. If you want to continue forward in a new terrain, you need to change the methods. You adapt. You find new tools and new guides and new learning. So we set down the grip of nostalgia that as the decision maker over mission. We set down the idea that yesterday's best practices automatically fit today's mission field. We set down habits that keep us turned inward when there's a world around us and all our neighbors that need a world, that need a church that's facing outward. See, this is an adaptive challenge ahead of us, one that cannot be solved with our existing knowledge, skills, and tools. It requires a shift in our expectations and attitudes and our habits. So what will we start doing? We'll become learners together. We'll pay attention to what is actually happening in worship spaces and in our community. We'll notice what a guest is experiencing the first 2 minutes they walk in. We'll notice what a family needs to feel at home. We'll notice what builds trust and what also erodes it. We'll listen and we'll try and we'll improve. And that's what adaptive leadership is. It's a community of people transforming in order to accomplish a shared mission in facing a changing world. And I'm going to say that again because that's an important one. That's adaptive leadership. It's a community of people transforming into accomplishing a shared mission in facing a changing world. So while we keep our eyes open for that new thing that God is already doing in our midst, we align our next steps with what God is doing now. So what will we do that fits our purpose? We will act like a people on purpose who are formed for praise, which means our praise becomes visible out in the world wherever we go. Our love shines wherever we go. A church, God's people, is a community that defines itself and organizes its life around real purpose of being an agent of God's mission in the world. See, the church's authentic organizing principle is mission. And when a church is on mission, it is being the true church. And our praise, it needs to take on some skin. It looks like welcome that feels like home and radical hospitality. It looks like invitation with someone's name on it. It looks like removing an obstacle that keeps someone on the outside, where we meet them in the world that they're in. It looks like one practical act of care that helps a neighbor feel seen again. And in a post-Christian world, transformation for mission sits at the center of our lives. We are adapting to thrive. We're adapting because we're called to reach an ever-changing world, participating in Jesus' mission and being shaped into his likeness. That is why we exist, to reveal God's love into the world and do his work out into the world. So as you leave today, you'll receive a handout, and this is something that I hope that we will all participate in, from youngest to the oldest, because this is our mission, what we're going to do on this card and for the next couple weeks. And there's 4 things that I would like for you to do on this card during the week, and the first is to write down 2 names on it. Write down 2 names of people that you know that are unchurched or that are de-churched. And what I mean by de-churched is maybe they used to attend church, but something's happened and they no longer go. The second step is I want you to pray for each of them daily. Put into place that you're not going to miss this card. So if that means taping it to the mirror in front of where you brush your teeth every morning and night, tape it to the mirror where you brush your teeth. But pray for them each and every day until Easter morning is what we're going to do. Third, I want you to take a step this week with one of those names, with one of those people. Take an action like send a text, an email, make a call, make an invitation for coffee or lunch, and invite them and ask them one question. How can I pray for you today? 4, I want you to bring that card back with you. And bring that card back as a reminder that we're making room for new people who need to meet Jesus and need to know his love, because we're learning a new way forward together. So this matters because we can stand at a ridgeline and call it faithfulness so far, or we can embrace the change this terrain requires and learn our way forward together and take that next faithful step to what God is in the midst of us doing right now. The way opens when a people decide to learn together, when we trade certainty for curiosity, comfort for mission, and autopilot for checking out and paying attention to what's happening around us. And every small shift that we make towards clarity and towards radical hospitality and invitation becomes a real doorway for someone who has been drifting, for someone who has been hurt, for someone who has been waiting for that reason to try church one more time. See, God is doing something new, and our willingness to adapt and turn that new thing into a lived experience for one of our neighbors. So here's where we land today, and I'll tell you the truth about it. New terrains rarely come with clear paths to walk on, but they do need to come with commitment that will lift our eyes, that will trust that God already has a way forward for us, that we'll believe that God is making a new way where we may not see one, that we choose to become learners together, because that's how we travel in uncharted territory. So we take that canoe off of our shoulders and let it become a sign of readiness. We will lift our eyes to the mountains that are in front of us and will trust God to make a way when we move. Because God is doing something new. Do you recognize it?